Hi, everyone. My name is Andrew Hughes. I'm the chair of the, sorry, I need to see the screen here, otherwise I'll be looking over there. I'm the chair of the Kantara Initiative Leadership Council, which is comprised of the chairs of all the work groups and discussion groups that you're hearing a lot about today. So in my part of this session, I'm going to talk a little bit about the consent receipt work that we're doing in the Consent and Information Sharing Working Group. And also talk about our Identity Assurance Approval Program and a little bit about the future work that we're going to be addressing in our Identity Assurance Framework and related programs. Bear with me through this presentation. Okay, so just a quick overview of a generalized, simplified flow for gathering consent from an individual to share their information with you as an organization. So one of the early steps, of course, write a privacy policy. When you go to collect the information from the person, provide a notice to them saying what you intend to do with the information, what you're going to collect. How are you processing it? Who's involved? What's the legal basis for collecting it? And are you sharing it onwards to other parties? Actually gather the consent of the individual to collect their information, and then keep on going. Okay, so that's a very simplified flow. As you were hearing in Eve's section on user-managed access and our approach on the blockchain question, one of the fundamental premises about Kantara is that we believe the user should be in control, wherever possible, of their own information. It's informational self-determination. Okay? In some circles, it's a radical concept, allowing the person to control what data is shared about them, how it's treated, how it's managed. Okay? The work we're doing on consent receipt and consent management fits into that side of the spectrum, where we're giving tools to the users, tools to the people, to help start to balance out the power dynamic between the organizations that take their data and do stuff, and the users' wishes and desires to protect their own privacy and know what's happening with their own information. Okay? So I just put a quick list of what things might help an individual for increasing their informational self-determination. Well-known privacy principles, so the Fair Information Privacy Principles. OECD has a set of principles. Canada has a set of principles. We're seeing patterns for privacy policies starting to develop. So you can actually buy customized privacy policies for your organization from service providers. We don't see them yet, but we're proposing that they should be created. Common patterns for collection and management of consent, and you'll see the consent receipt stuff falls into that. And the specific work that we've done, the actionable receipt of consent. A few emerging technologies and future technologies for consent management, for information management actually. We're seeing general data protection regulation compliant platforms in Europe, either identity providers, platform providers that will, they won't guarantee it, but they are compliant with GDPR, so if you use their platform, by inference you are as well. Some of the streams in consumer IAM as well are dealing with information management from the customer point of view as opposed to the organization. And as Eve mentioned, the Privacy Control Center, I believe. So we see prototypes of that sort of thing starting to emerge. So what is the consent receipt specification? It's now an approved standards publication, a recommendation from the Kantara Initiative. You can get it from kantarainitiative.org. It's quite simple. I mean, it's not a massively complex thing. Simply data structure, definition of fields. It's got a JSON structure as a representation of those fields in a schema kind of format. Has a little bit of guidance on what kinds of values should go in each field. So there's a field for timestamp information for when the consent was collected. There's fields for the privacy policy in effect, the purposes that you're collecting the personal information for, that sort of thing. So there's some guidance in that. Really what the consent receipt is, it's a layered privacy notice, right? So it's got different sections that you can present to the person, depending on what context you're in. So if it's a very constrained device scenario, there's a small number of mandatory fields that you should show them. If they want to dig deeper, you should be able to dig deeper into the notice. And then, of course, because it's a transactional receipt concept, it has those timestamps and transactional metadata. It's not entirely useful right now. I hate to admit it. No, actually, I like to admit it. That means there's more work to do. It's the basic structure. It needs customization. It needs tailoring for the different regulations which the organizations are operating within. So if you're a company operating in Europe, you will have different purposes for collecting personal information, perhaps. Different regulations for sure, as opposed to in the US or in a state or in Canada. So what the Consent and Information Sharing Working Group is working on next is basically specific guidance and these overlays of suggested values for different regulations in different jurisdictions. This is really where it comes to implementation and learning from the experience in the field. Okay. We are, like I mentioned on the slide there, of course, GDPR is a very hot topic, as very much so in the EU. When we were talking at the European Identity Conference a few weeks ago, every talk had some GDPR or PSD2 angle to it. That was basically top of mind for them. PSD2 being the new banking regulations. And also at the bottom there you can see that conformity assessment schemes, which is one of the backbone services of Kantara, will be developed from the specification. Okay. So, just a few Kantara work areas that are related to this. So currently we've got the consent receipt specification going to its 1.1 incarnation by the end of the year. Separate to that, we have a work group that is a liaison to the ISO SC27 Working Group 5 Subcommittee Working Group, which is identity management and privacy technology standards. So if any of these, just let me know if any of these numbers ring a bell. 29115, 24760. There's a family of identity proofing, identity management, identity systems architecture standards that are being developed and enhanced at ISO. And you can actually join a working group at Kantara to provide input as experts to that work. We can talk about that later, and any of us here can talk about that later if you're interested. Otherwise, you would have to go through a national body representation to get to the ISO working groups. A few groups that are being formulated as we conference here. The Kantara-wide legal group, where we're probably going to merge the ideas of UMA, consent management, identity relationship management, basically what the lawyers have to say about the practical working aspects of the technology and specifications that we're developing. And the bottom one is, I'll say it in a very excited tone. It's actually quite exciting because consent management systems is the bigger picture within which sits consent receipt, layered privacy notices, and other privacy-related practices. We're starting a working group that will define requirements for consent management systems. Broad applicability because you can think of any website, any system that asks you to accept terms and conditions. Well, in some ways of looking at it, that is consenting to whatever they're getting from you, personal information a lot of the time, to access their services. What we're trying to do is see if there are any common requirements, eventually hoping to get to standards of practice for wherever consent is gathered from an individual, all with this idea of informational self-determination. So that is actually the most exciting point on all the slides here. So sorry.
I was going to say, a quest for funds. We think we might have half.
We're waiting on a tweet or we're waiting on an SMS message to see if we get a funder for that right away or not. If anyone's interested, by the way, please come and talk to Colin.
Funding by Twitter.
That's what, and Skype.
Okay, so I'll just have a few slides on the Identity Assurance Assessment Program. So as I mentioned before, very briefly, Kantara operates and defines and manages an identity assurance framework, which is really a set of documents. It's about this thick, but we don't expect anyone to read all of the documents, fortunately. Basically what it is, it's the mandatory requirements if you're a credential service provider, which is defined as offering credential management services, identity proofing, registration, enrollment services, and verifications, creating that identity database behind the credentials, and then credential authentication. It also has the assessment criteria that an assessor would use to assess an operating service to see if they conform to the specification, and various rules and qualification requirements for the assessors themselves. Also, an approval program and trustmark licensing process. The general flow is an assessor is engaged by a credential service provider who goes through an assessment. The assessor provides a statement of conformity, which expresses that the CSP conforms to the specifications with any non-conformities, right? So any gaps that need to be filled. And then the approval boards can approve that and get a trust mark, which the CSP can put on the website. Okay? As an incredibly fast overview of that. The Kantara trust mark is significant because it demonstrates conformity to an open specification. So if you're a credential provider and you display the approved trust mark, anyone that cares to check can go and see what your service is supposed to be doing by reading the identity assurance framework. So the framework describes what a credential provider should be doing, and the conformity mark says that you as a service provider have been evaluated and are doing what's specified there. I know I didn't explain that very clearly, but it's a way to verify what the providers are actually offering you without having to audit them directly. The approval program, the assurance framework, is aligned with NIST Special Publication 863 and other international standards. It's not specific to any of them, but it takes the common mandatories from each of them. And one of the dollar values of the trust mark is that some U.S. federal contracts require your credential service to be approved under an approved program, and Kantara runs an approved program for that. So if you're provisioning credentials to some federal government agencies, you need the trust mark. What are we doing in the future with it? Fixes, tweaks, clarification for assessors, clarification for applicants, people going through, organizations going through the program. You may be aware that the NIST publication 863, what's it called now? It's not e-authentication anymore, it's digital authentication guidelines, is in version 3. Excellent piece of work. Very thorough public review and comment exercise was done with it, which greatly enhanced it. And we're looking forward to updating and realigning the framework to basically get better alignment with the new structures in the document. We're also working with research and education federations in the US and in Europe to incorporate the practices and learnings that the active federations in research and education have had and bring that into the specifications that Kantara has, okay, so into the framework. Basically, it's what does a federation or operator do? How do they operate with organizations wanting to sign up with their identity federation? So that'll be plugged in with the Kantara framework in the next year or two, I think, as the pace of these goes. And then finally, adaptation of the assessment program to other schemes. Consent management systems being the first one that we're targeting. I'm going to take a bit of a tangent here, if you'll indulge me. Okay, so that's some of the work that's going on in Kantara. Just want to dip in slightly to just a bit of background on the assurance framework, how the assessment works, and why we're bothering to do it at all, right? So you may have heard the concept of a trust framework. Really what it is definition on screen. It's a multi-party legal contract that defines roles and responsibilities. And in this case, we're talking digital identity. So the credential managers, the authentication providers, various technologies involved for the offering and consuming of federated digital identities. Okay. Trust frameworks underlie federation agreements, right? And they are used, but it's really when you need a multi-party legal contract for the exchange of information for digital identity. We've been seeing a trend, as most technologies do, towards standardization. At the OpenID Foundation, they're doing some great work on standardizing role definitions for basically federated digital identity systems, and standardizing terminology. Right now, there's lots of different definitions that really all say the same thing. We're discovering over time. The international community is discovering over time. So what is this drive to standardization for? Well, from ISO.org, so International Organization for Standardization, this is some text about standards. So the rules, guidelines, or characteristics for activities for achieving the optimum degree of order in a given context. I say that with a smile because there are many standards, and they do help bring a commonality of practice or a commonality of implementation. And in fact, when you do interoperability standards, they allow you to connect systems together. Okay. So back to the identity roles. I'm assuming, I hope, that these identity roles are reasonably, some of them or all of them are reasonably familiar to you. Right? They're fairly standard. If you look at the wide range of documents and specifications and standards, the definitions have been converging, right? 5 years ago, they're all different. They're all grouped differently. They weren't really functionally based. They were whatever you implemented based. But the functions are getting sorted out. Whose responsibilities or what are getting sorted out as well. Okay. And here are some of the standards. As someone has said once, many people have said before, the great thing about standards is that there are so many to choose from. But there's consolidation going on in the standards field here. Now, in contrast to digital identity, the standardization of roles, definitions, terminology around consent management and consent management systems, the consent management world is very immature. There's a massive level of concern in the EU for GDPR conformity. But no one knows what it is or what's involved, it seems. There's a lot of consulting going on right now about what it means to be following the GDPR correctly. Here are some of the terms, some of the roles that you will see showing up for consent management. But aside from the ones that are defined in regulations, there's confusion about what functions and what roles go where. Okay? There is not a broad consensus for system implementations for any of the roles. I tried to list standards for consent management, and I couldn't find a whole lot. There's a few at ISO that are under development. There's lots of guidance from information commissioners and privacy commissioner offices. The UK ICO is doing a great job supporting the adoption of GDPR, helping industry understand what their responsibilities are and how to achieve compliance. But really, it's an open ground. So, you probably guessed where I'm going with this. Not there. I'll stay there. So this is referring back to the work that Kantara is about to embark on in a working group. Defining what the requirements are for consent management systems. What are the common characteristics that should be there? What are the mandatories? And then eventually get into conformity assessment criteria, plug it into an assessment program so that there can be a trust mark issued for a compliant consent management system. Okay. Hopefully that wasn't too jumpy. So other emerging areas that are on the horizon for Kantara. We're not sure how these will evolve and mature over time. Blockchain, Eve, drink. Yeah. So what are the requirements for everything that is not on-chain, right? So who are the authorities? What are the requirements for operating a system that supports a blockchain or distributed ledger? There's less work on that side of the fence than there is on the technologies of the chains themselves, the ledgers themselves. So that's where we're positioning the blockchain and smart contract working group, is to start to get at that technical and non-technical supporting environment. What do the operators have to do? Internet of Things. One day it's going to be real, and on that day, everything's going to crash because the operators don't know they're working on it. And industrial Internet of Things is taking a lead on this, and GE is doing a lot of great work there. So consumer side, commercial side, and then delegated access authorization. We see protocols emerging, but what do they mean to operators in practice? So you'll see some of that touching the legal subgroup, the legal working group that we're going to create. What do the operators have to comply with? What are their responsibilities? That sort of thing. That's what I got.
Thanks, Andrew. That's great.